Pressure does not create weakness. It exposes it. The pressure does not add anything to the mind that was not already there. It removes what was covering the actual state of the training. The person who appears composed in comfortable conditions and collapses under genuine pressure has not suddenly become weaker. The genuine state of the training has simply become visible. And the person whose composure holds under genuine pressure is not demonstrating an unusual strength. They are demonstrating the trained state that the pressure has now made visible. If your mind is not trained, you will break under pressure. Not because the pressure is too powerful, because the training is insufficient for the pressure level. The training is what this audiobook develops. Introduction. The trained mind under pressure. Control is not the natural state of the mind under pressure. The natural state of the mind under pressure is the activated, urgency-driven, cognitively compromised condition that the preceding chapter described in the context of the chaotic environment. The control is built. It is the developed quality of the mind that has been specifically trained for the conditions that pressure produces. The training is specific, progressive, and accumulative. Each chapter of this audiobook develops a specific layer of the trained mind's architecture: the awareness, the regulation, the structured thinking, the slowing discipline, and the identity-level development that makes the mental control the natural expression of the trained person rather than the effortful override of the untrained one. The control is the destination. The training is the path. Chapter 1. What pressure does to the mind. Pressure changes thinking. The specific changes that pressure produces in the cognitive functioning are precisely the changes that most degrade the quality of the thinking in the situations where the quality of the thinking matters most. Pressure arrives in the moments of genuine difficulty, the high-stakes decision, the conflict, the failure, the unexpected demand that exceeds the comfortable capacity. These are the moments when the clear thinking, the careful assessment, and the considered response are most required. They are also the moments when pressure has produced its most significant cognitive impairment. The stress response to the pressure produces the neurological changes described in multiple earlier audiobooks of this series: the cortisol flooding that reduces working memory capacity, the amygdala suppression of the prefrontal regulatory function, the attentional narrowing that compresses the observational field to the most immediately threatening element. Each of these changes is the direct reduction of the cognitive quality available for the moment that most requires it. The stress response is the most consistent and most systematically and precisely timed cognitive impairment available, arriving precisely when the unimpaired cognitive quality is most needed. Cognitive distortion under pressure is the specific qualitative change in the thinking that the stress response produces beyond the quantitative reduction in the cognitive resource available. Not only less cognitive quality, but the specific distortion of the quality that remains the amplification of the threatening features of the situation. The suppression of the moderating contextual information, the catastrophization of the assessment, and the compression of the time horizon that makes the long-frame consequences of the immediate decision invisible. These distortions are not the accurate assessment of the situation. They are the accurate expression of the activated emotional state. The pressure has converted the thinking into the emoting. Emotional takeover is the specific mechanism through which the cognitive distortion becomes the behavioral output, the point at which the emotional system's distorted assessment of the situation has become the primary driver of the decision and the action rather than the deliberate cognitive assessment. The emotional takeover is the specific loss of control that this audiobook trains the mind to prevent. Not the prevention of the emotional experience. That experience is real and its information is valuable. The prevention of the emotional system's unmediated governance of the behavioral output, the interposition of the trained mind between the emotional experience and the behavioral result. Chapter 2. Why control is lost. Control is not lost by accident. Control is lost through the specific, identifiable, manageable conditions that produce the loss. The management of the conditions is the specific practice that prevents the loss, not the heroic willpower of the person who forces the control in the moment of the loss, but the deliberate management of the conditions that make the loss predictable before it occurs. Triggers are the specific inputs that reliably produce the activation that initiates the control loss sequence. Each person's triggers are specific to their history, their sensitivities, and their established patterns. The management of the triggers begins with the mapping, the honest identification of the specific inputs that reliably produce the specific activation in you, and continues with the anticipatory preparation that the mapping makes possible, the prior setting of the regulatory practice for the specific trigger type before the trigger has fired and the activation has begun. Patterns are the established neural pathways through which the trigger produces the activation, and the activation produces the behavioral output, the habitual sequences that have been rehearsed many times and now execute with the automaticity of the well-predicated response. The pattern is not chosen in the moment. It runs. The management of the pattern requires the specific rewiring practice described in Chapter 6 of the Stop Reacting to Everything audiobook, the consistent application of the alternative response in the presence of the trigger, building the competing neural pathway until the alternative becomes the more practiced and therefore more automatic response. Overload is the third condition that produces the control loss, the state in which the cumulative demands of the pressure environment have exceeded the regulatory resource available for their management. The overload state does not announce itself dramatically. It produces the gradual degradation of the regulatory quality that registers as the reduced patience, the slightly reduced cognitive flexibility, the mildly increased reactivity to the ordinary triggers. These are the early signals of the overload state, the signals that the recovery practice of Chapter 9 of the Mental Strength audiobook is specifically designed to address before the degradation reaches the level of the control loss. Chapter 3. Building Mental Control. Control is training. The mental control that holds under genuine pressure is not the natural default of the untraining mind. It is the built, practiced, progressively more reliable expression of the specific neural infrastructure that the consistent application of the specific practices produces. The building is specific, the practices are specific, the infrastructure is real. And the control that the infrastructure produces is the control that the pressure level reveals as present rather than absent. Discipline is the first dimension of the building, the specific quality of the consistent application of the practices across the conditions that most press against the application. The discipline of applying the breath regulation when the urgency is pressing toward the immediate unregulated response. The discipline of applying the thinking framework when the emotional flooding is pressing toward the reactive decision. The discipline of maintaining the governed behavioral output when the social pressure is pressing toward the compliance with the reactive norm. Each of these is a specific act of the discipline that builds the mental control through the consistent exercise of it. Awareness is the second dimension, the specific attentional practice of maintaining the visibility of the internal state rather than allowing the internal state to operate as the invisible driver of the behavior. The awareness that the activation has begun before it has reached the level of the control loss. The awareness that the thinking has begun to distort before the distorted assessment has produced the decision that the accurate assessment would not have made. The awareness that the behavioral output is being produced by the reactive pattern rather than the deliberate assessment before the reactive output has been committed. Each layer of the awareness is the specific intervention point at which the control can be exercised rather than restored after the loss. Repetition is the third dimension, the mechanism through which the discipline and the awareness practices build the neural infrastructure that makes the mental control progressively more natural and less effortful. Each application of the discipline is a repetition. Each repetition is a small increment of the competing neural pathway that builds the alternative to the reactive default. The increments accumulate. The infrastructure builds. The control that required the deliberate effort in the early training stages becomes the more natural expression of the more developed architecture in the later ones. Chapter 4. Slowing down under pressure. Slowing down equals control. The specific mechanism through which slowing down produces the control in the pressure context is the physiological and neurological intervention that the deliberate physical deceleration constitutes. The pressure produces the physiological urgency, the elevated heart rate, the cortisol flooding, the physical tension that signals to the brain the necessity of the fast response. The deliberate physical slowing, the reduced pace of movement, the slower speech, the deliberate breath sends the competing physiological signal that counteracts the urgency signal and partially restores the cognitive quality that the urgency was impairing. Breaking urgency in the pressure context is the specific application of the urgency examination practice that was developed in the earlier audiobooks of this series. The brief, deliberate check of the genuine temporal requirement of the decision or action that the urgency is pressing toward. What actually happens if this decision is delayed by 2 minutes? The honest answer, in most pressure situations, is that the genuinely important elements of the situation are not materially affected by the brief delay, but the quality of the decision produced after the slowing is materially better than the quality of the decision produced from the urgency-driven immediate response. Stabilizing the mind through the slowing is the specific cognitive benefit of the deliberate physical deceleration. The reduced physiological urgency partially restores the prefrontal axis that the activation was suppressing. The restored prefrontal axis allows the partial recovery of the deliberate cognitive quality, the thinking that the pressure was impairing. The thinking quality that is recovered through the brief stabilization is the thinking quality that produces the better decision. The slowing is the prerequisite. The better decision is the outcome. The control is the mechanism connecting the two. Thinking clearly after the slowing is the specific cognitive act of the stabilized deliberate mind, the application of the thinking framework to the actual situation rather than the activation state's amplified version of it. What is actually here? What does this actually require? What is the most useful action available within the actual scope of influence? These three questions, applied in the brief window that the slowing has created, produce the clear thinking that the pressure was specifically designed to prevent. Chapter 5. Emotional resistance. Emotions must not govern actions. Emotional resistance is not the resistance to emotional experience. It is the specific built capacity to receive the emotional experience fully, genuinely, with the complete registration of its informational content without the emotional experience becoming the unmediated governor of the behavioral output. The resistance is between the feeling and the action, the governed interval in which the deliberate mind assesses the feeling's informational content and produces the behavioral response that the genuine requirements of the situation warrant, rather than the behavioral response that the feeling is pressing toward. Regulation in the emotional resistance context is the active management of the emotional activation level, the physiological and cognitive practices that keep the activation within the functional range rather than allowing it to exceed the level where the prefrontal governance is compromised. The breath regulation, the physical settling, the awareness practice, the naming practice, each is a regulation tool that serves the specific function of maintaining the emotional activation within the range that supports rather than degrades the cognitive quality. Control in the emotional resistance context is the specific quality of the maintained governance, the maintained connection between the deliberate mind and the behavioral output in the presence of the emotional activation that is pressing to replace that governance with the direct expression of the activation. The control does not eliminate the emotional experience. It maintains the deliberate mind's role as the translator of the emotional experience into the behavioral output, rather than allowing the emotional experience to produce the behavioral output directly. Balance in the emotional resistance context is the specific quality of the regulated emotional life, the full emotional engagement with the genuine aspects of the situation that the engagement warrants, governed by the deliberate mind, producing the behavioral outputs that the genuine requirements of the situation warrant rather than the behavioral outputs that the unregulated emotional experience would produce. The balance is not the flat effect of the suppressed emotional life. It is the full emotional life, genuinely felt, deliberately expressed. Chapter 6. Clear thinking systems. Thinking must be structured. The clear thinking system is the specific cognitive structure that the disciplined mind applies to the pressure situation to produce the clarity that the unstructured mind cannot access in those conditions. The system is not elaborate. It does not require the extended deliberation of the comfortable conditions. It is the brief, specific cognitive framework that organizes the thinking around the genuine requirements of the situation rather than around the most salient or most urgency-generating elements. Logical thinking in the pressure context is the specific discipline of maintaining the cause and effect reasoning against the pressure toward the emotional conclusion. The emotion produces the conclusion the situation is dangerous. The person is hostile, the outcome will be bad, and then provides the evidence that supports the conclusion by attending to the confirming information and suppressing the disinforming information. The logical thinking discipline reverses this. The evidence is assessed first. The conclusion follows from the evidence, and the assessment includes both the confirming and the disconfirming information. Decision frameworks in the pressure context are the specific cognitive structures that organize the decision process into the minimum viable sequence that produces the better decision rather than the urgency-driven immediate one. The minimum viable decision framework for the pressure context has three elements: the accurate situation description, what is actually happening, stripped of the emotional amplification; the option assessment, what alternatives are available beyond the most urgency consistent one; and the consequence evaluation, what does the most plausible response produce one step into the future. These three elements, completed in the brief interval that the slowing practice creates, produce the decision quality that the urgency-driven immediate response cannot achieve. Clarity in the clear thinking system is the specific cognitive state that the structured thinking produces, the quality of seeing the situation as it actually is rather than as the activated emotional state is representing it. The clarity is not certainty. Genuine uncertainty is a real feature of most pressure situations, and the clear thinking accurately registers the uncertainty rather than resolving it through the false certainty of the emotional conclusion. The clarity is the accurate perception of what is actually present, including the genuine uncertainties, which is the most reliable foundation available for the decisions the situation requires. Chapter 7: Decision-making under stress. Decisions under pressure determine outcomes. The decisions made under the genuine pressure of the significant life situations are the decisions that most determine the trajectory of the things that matter. The career crisis, the relationship conflict, the financial difficulty, the professional failure, each of these produces the specific pressure conditions that most consistently degrade the decision quality. And the degraded decision quality in these specific situations produces the outcomes that are most difficult to reverse: the relationships damaged by the reactive communication, the opportunities foreclosed by the impulsive commitment, the professional situations worsened by the panic-driven response. Calm choices in the stress context are produced through the minimum viable decision framework developed in the preceding chapter, the structured thinking that keeps the decision process anchored to the actual features of the situation rather than to the activated emotional state's version of them. The calm choice is not always the conservative choice or the delayed choice. It is the choice that was made from the genuine assessment rather than from the urgency of the activation. The calm choice may be fast when the genuine temporal requirement is genuine. It is deliberately slow when the urgency is manufactured. Avoiding mistakes in the stress context is the specific practice of recognizing the decision patterns that most consistently produce the regrettable outcomes under pressure: the impulsive commitment made from the urgency of the excitement, the defensive withdrawal made from the urgency of the threat, the aggressive escalation made from the urgency of the anger, and the premature closure made from the urgency of the discomfort with the unresolved situation. Each of these patterns is recognizable from the specific quality of the urgency that is pressing toward the decision. Genuine temporal requirements produce genuine urgency. Manufactured urgency is the emotional state's demand for the immediate resolution of its own discomfort. Strategic thinking in the stress decision context is the specific extension of the decision assessment beyond the immediate consequences to the second and third order effects, the consequences of the consequences. The stress context compresses the time horizon. The decision is being evaluated primarily against the immediate relief of the urgency. The strategic extension of the time horizon reveals the second and third order effects that the immediate relief may foreclose. The strategic choice is the choice that is best across the relevant time horizon rather than only in the immediate moment. Chapter 8. Training the brain. The brain changes when you train it. The neuroplastic changes that the consistent training of the mental control practices produces are real, measurable, and durable. The brain changes in response to the consistent demands made on it. The consistent demand of the breath regulation builds the physiological regulation capacity, the reduced cortisol response, the faster return to the functional baseline, the lower activation threshold for the parasympathetic counterregulation. The consistent demand of the structured thinking builds the cognitive structuring habit, the more rapid deployment of the thinking framework, the more automatic application of the cause and effect reasoning, the more consistent maintenance of the broader option set against the urgency-driven narrowing. Neuroplasticity is the specific biological mechanism through which the training produces the capacity, the structural modification of the neural pathways through the consistent use of those pathways. The pathways that are consistently used become more efficient. The pathways that are not used become less dominant. The consistent use of the regulation and the structured thinking pathways builds the efficiency of those pathways relative to the reactive default pathways. The more efficient regulated pathway becomes the more natural response. The trained mind is the mind whose regulated pathways have been built to higher efficiency than the reactive defaults through the consistent practice of the training. Habit formation is the behavioral expression of the neuroplastic changes, the progressive automation of the practices that the consistent repetition produces. The breath regulation that was initially the deliberate intervention against the urgency becomes the automatic first response to the onset of the activation. The structured thinking that was initially the effortful application of the framework against the reactive default becomes the natural cognitive orientation to the pressure situation. The awareness practice that was initially the deliberate direction of attention toward the internal state becomes the continuous background monitoring that keeps the internal state visible without the deliberate attentional effort. Each of these automations is the expression of the neural pathway efficiency built through the consistent practice. Repetition cycles are the specific training schedule that produces the habit formation, the consistent application of the practices across many instances over sufficient time. The neural pathway efficiency is not built through the single dramatic application of the practice in the face of the overwhelming challenge. It is built through the many ordinary applications across the ordinary daily situations that the training is consistently applied to. The ordinary situations are the repetition cycles. The repetition cycles are the training. The training is the capacity. Chapter 9. Staying stable in chaos. Stability is rare. The stability of the trained mind in the chaotic environment is rare precisely because it is built through the specific practices that most people have not developed rather than naturally available. Most people's stability in the ordinary conditions disappears under sufficient pressure. The trained mind's stability is the stability that the pressure reveals as present rather than absent, which is the specific quality that makes it both rare and valuable. Emotional control in the stability context is the maintained regulation across the extended duration of the chaotic environment, not only the brief acute management of the single high activation moment, but the sustained governance of the emotional state across the many demands and the many activation points of the genuinely demanding period. The sustained governance requires the recovery practice, the deliberate restoration of the regulatory resource between the activation episodes to be available across the duration. Without the recovery, the regulatory resource depletes and the stability erodes into the reactivity that the depletion produces. Mental balance in the stability context is the specific cognitive quality of the maintained clarity across the sustained demands of the chaotic environment, the continued availability of the structured thinking, the continued breadth of the attentional field, the continued accuracy of the situational reading despite the sustained pressure that is pressing toward the progressive narrowing and distortion that the unmanaged activation produces. The mental balance requires the deliberate maintenance of the cognitive practices across the sustained pressure, the continued application of the framework, the continued return of the attention to the genuine priorities, the continued regulation of the emotional activation. Discipline is the quality that sustains the emotional control and the mental balance across the extended duration of the chaotic environment, the specific maintained commitment to the practices when the cumulative demands are pressing hardest against their application, when the depletion is most significant and the practices are most effortful. The discipline at the end of the extended chaotic period when the resource is most depleted and the practices are most demanding is the specific quality that the training is building toward. That is when the difference between the trained and the untrained mind is most visible and most consequential. Chapter 10. Becoming mentally strong. A strong mind does not break under pressure. The mental strength that does not break under pressure is the specific integrated expression of everything the preceding 9 chapters have been building: the awareness that keeps the internal state visible, the regulation that maintains the activation within the functional range, the slowing that creates the interval for the deliberate mind to engage, the structured thinking that organizes the assessment around the genuine requirements, the decision discipline that produces the calm choice from the accurate assessment, the training that builds the neural infrastructure through the consistent repetition, and the stability that sustains all of these across the extended duration of the genuine pressure. Identity is the dimension of the mental strength that makes it sustainable beyond the effortful practice, the self-concept of the person who does these things rather than the aspiration of the person who wants to do them. The identity shift from the reactive default to the trained mental control is the product of the accumulated evidence of many instances of the successful application of the practices in the situations that genuinely tested them. Each successful instance adds to the evidence. The evidence builds the identity. The identity sustains the behavior. The strength is the natural expression of the developed identity. Strength in the mental control context is not the dramatic performance of the invulnerable. It is the specific, consistent, reliable quality of the thinking and the behavior that the trained architecture produces across the full range of conditions: the comfortable and the genuinely demanding, the predictable and the chaotic. The mental strength is the trained reliability. The reliability is what the pressure reveals. Long-term control is the ongoing development of the mental strength through the continued application of the practices and the continued building of the neural infrastructure. The development does not stop at the achievement of the strong enough threshold. It continues through the progressive extension to new pressure levels, new challenge types, and new demands on the developed capacity. The strength deepens. The control becomes more reliable. The pressure that once broke the thinking finds an architecture that has been built to hold. Closing. The control that holds. Pressure will arrive. It has always arrived. The question is what it finds. The 10 chapters of this audiobook have been building a specific answer: the trained architecture of the regulated mind. The structured thinking, the deliberate slowing, the consistent discipline, and the identity-level development that makes the mental control the natural expression of who you are rather than the effortful override of who you default to being. Pressure will come, the trained mind will hold.